Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you all today. My name is Scheepers, and I am the lead pastor at Grace Church. And I'm excited about a new series we're starting, Purposeful Parenting. Now, if you are a parent, can you raise your hand if parenting is easy? Can you raise your hand if parenting is hard? I've got a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and parenting is hard. And here's the thing, even when you hope you're doing a good job, you still wonder about whether you're getting it right or not. It's still something we wonder about. It is something that we often feel like we wish we could see the other side to see if what I'm currently doing is a good job. But here's an interesting stat about parenting that I read a while ago. According to the Forbes Advisor, a survey that they done, they found that one of the top 8 reasons why people get divorced is because of differences about parenting. One of the top 8 reasons. You're like, well, still only one of 8. There's a lot of other reasons. Part of this survey, they asked what was the most common things couples disagreed with and had fights about before they got divorced. Because people sometimes list the reason, but that's not often the reason that led to just the unraveling of the marriage. And 43% of people who were divorced mentioned parenting differences as one of the most common types of conflict they had before divorce. 43%, almost half of people that got divorced said, this is one of the things we fight about the most. And I'm like, should it be like that? Now, I want to read you something quickly, kind of like a verse that's just been on my mind as I think about this series. From Psalm 127, verse 3 to verse 5. And this is Solomon writing. And Solomon had a whole bunch of children. But hear what he says about children. He says in verse 3 that children are a gift from the Lord. Children are a gift from God. They are say that word with me, they are a reward from Him. They're not a punishment. They're not a reason for marriage to fall apart, for marriages to fall apart. They're a reward from Him. Children born to a young man are like arrows in a warrior's hands. How joyful is the man whose quiver is full of them. He will not be put to shame when he confronts his accusers at the city gate. And I read these words and I'm like, listen, if children is such an incredible gift from God, if they're such a great gift from God, then parenting is not supposed to destroy marriages. And if children is such a gift from God, then parenting is something that we should all take incredibly seriously. So that is why we started this series. And I'm going to speak to you in a moment if you might not be a parent yet or you have adult children. But what we're going to do in this series is we're going to look at 4 principles, biblical principles, that will help set your parenting up for success so that your children can become who God wants them to be. And that doesn't matter whether your children are babies, whether they are teenagers, or whether you have adult children that's already left the house. These principles are principles that are not how to. So I'm not going to share with you tactics and say like, okay, this is how you're going to do all the details in your parenting. This is a principle. It means it's a foundational thing that God has given us on which we can build our tactics, our how to for parenting. Because each of us will do it a little different, right? But these principles, if they are not in place, you're probably going to have issues with your parenting. So I want you to think back for a moment to the beginning. And I'm not talking about your mother's womb. That's too far back. I'm talking after that. When you think about your earliest years, what are the things or people that influenced you the most? That shaped your life the most? Whether you can remember this or not, I'm guessing most of us would say our parents, right? But even if you cannot remember that they were the most influential thing in your life, they were. That is just a reality unless they didn't raise you. And here is the thing that is so clearly evident with me, especially with my 2 girls, Abigail and Annabelle. Children are like sponges when they are little. Whatever they are immersed in, they will soak it up, whether it's good or whether it's bad. Whether the water is pure or the water is dirty, they just suck it up. But then as they turn older and children become teenagers, they turn into mirrors and they start to reflect whatever they were immersed in. Your marriage influences how children move through the world. Psychologists say that especially in the early years, the way you live as parents is the thing that will develop their values and the worldviews for the rest of their lives. Your marriage matters. The emotional climate in your house is created, especially within your marriage, that affect your child's current and future well-being. Years ago, I was a youth pastor. For 4 years, I was a youth pastor. And we used to go to these camps at the beginning of our summer breaks in South Africa, which was the end of November. And we would go to the ocean for about a week. And during that time, it wasn't just our church, but 4 or 5 churches combined. So we would have 250 children that show up on a bus. We would already be there sitting and watching these children unpack the buses. And they always did this fun game where they had to pack all of the baggage on this massive heap and then had to sort it out. It was like a get to know each other kind of thing. But Yolanda and I would sit in this little bungalow on the porch and just watch these kids interact. And what was interesting, as a very young couple who didn't have children yet, we could sit and we could say, that kid, their parents probably have big issues at home, based on only what we saw in that interaction. And then we would get to know these children, so we don't know them, right? About 3/4 of them are not from our church. And as we would get to know them, it would come out that there's real significant issues at home. So it is, from an outside perspective, possible to see in children's lives when there are marriage troubles with their parents. Your marriage, whether you want to know it or not, impacts your children just as your parents' marriage impacted you. And that is why today, as we start this series, our first topic in this series is the marriage principle. If you ask me today, Louis, I want to be a purposeful parent, where do I start? I'm going to say you start with the marriage principle. And I want to give you a trailer quickly. You know when you go to watch, I hate it when I watch a movie and I didn't watch the trailer. Because it's kind of like you walk into something blind, right? You're like, what am I watching? Is it a comedy? Is it an action? Should I be afraid? Like, I want to see a trailer and know what I'm getting into. So I want to give you a bit of a trailer. And there's 3 things that I hope to show you today. One is the current norm of parenting, what's going on in our world. And then the question, is that what God intended it to be or not? The second thing, I hope to show you how you can protect your family by protecting your marriage. And lastly, why this even matters. What is the benefit of actually practicing this principle of marriage as a parenting principle? Why that is so important. And we're going to look at a whole bunch of different texts in the Bible. So you can open your Bible to text with me, but I would recommend rather just read it off the screen and make some notes, okay, so that you can go and read it again later, because we'll be working through a whole bunch of them. But I also want to do this disclaimer. If you are a single parent today, marriage might not be real for you. And you might be single because you've always been single. You never had a husband or a wife. You might be single because you are divorced. You might be single because a spouse died. I don't know your circumstances. What I do know is marriage might not be real for you now, but what we still can hold on to is the ideal that God has set. That doesn't change God's ideal picture of parenting. But what I am going to try to do is, as we talk, and we'll be focusing on marriages today, but I am going to try at the end of this and throughout it to also apply to your life if you might be a single parent. And listen, if you're not a parent yet, focus on this as well. We were married 8 years before we had children. And the better prepared you are for anything in life, the better you will do at it. So take some notes. Keep that for 8 or 10 years and then reread those notes in a couple of years. But let's talk about what our world currently looks like, parenting in the world we live in. Sociologists tell us, basically psychologists, but for group studies, right? Instead of individual, they study patterns in society. And sociologists tells us that childhood has changed significantly since the 19th century. Now, not since you were little, since the 19th century. Everyone in this room, when we were little, experienced something very different to all the generations before us. But that effect has sped up, and in the last 50 years, we've seen the biggest changes. Here's some of them. We have lower infant mortality due to better medical services. Child labor, which was very common in the old days, has been regulated and restricted. So our children are more protected. Education is the norm for most children in the world these days, especially in the Western world, but even in developing countries. Most children have access to some education. These days, parents spend the most time and the most money on their children than ever before in history. And children also has a bigger voice in society due to legislation. So it's very interesting when we look at some of these statistics. Sociologists suggest that our society has become more child-centric than it has ever been in the past. And I think when we talk about things like that, we all can agree that these are good things. It's things I want for my children. I want to be a present dad. I want them to be safe. I want them to have medical care and education. So these are good things. But here is a problem that we're facing as this has been developing. Sociologists are very worried, and this was a study specifically, this part that I'm talking about now, that came from the US, where they are worried about the crumbling of society because of the crumbling of families. So the rate at which families are crumbling, that the divorce rate and everything going up, families just dissolving, they are worried that it's going to affect society in general. Because if you think of any society, the fibers that weave it together are not really the individual people, but families. Families are the fibers of society. So as families unravel, our society tends to unravel as well. So here's the question. If so much good has happened when it comes to children, why do we have this massive problem of families just unraveling? Now, I've read studies on this, but I don't need studies to understand why this is happening. Yolanda and I were married for 8 years before we had children. 8 years. So we were pretty much set in our ways. We were a couple that really spent a lot of time together and did everything together. And then Abigail came along. And if you ask me, Louis, what are some of the toughest years of marriage that you've experienced in the last 14 years? I would say probably year one. Because when you get married and you spend 24/7 in the house together for the first time, it's hard to figure out just like, what are we going to do? What are we going to eat? Who's cleaning what, right? That's challenging. But one of the other toughest times I've ever gone through was the first year after Abigail was born. And the reason for that is because when children are born, it is very, very easy to prioritize that little tiny human being that you feel love for, that you have never experienced before. It is very easy to prioritize that little human being above everything else. And if you do not decide what you're going to prioritize in your marriage and in your parenting, guess what will determine it for you? The squeakiest wheel. And let me tell you, there are very few things as squeaky as little human beings. They are incredibly squeaky, right? And soon before you know it, your whole world revolves around your children, and I don't mean that in a good way. It becomes completely child-centric. Your marriage, your relationship, everything you do becomes child-centric. And here is the problem. If you say, like, what's wrong with it? I should care about my children. When parenting is placed ahead of marriage, parenting and marriage both suffer. Parenting and marriage suffers. Why? Because parents start hurting rather than helping their kids, because spouses spend so much negative energy battling each other because marriage is not a priority, because the marriage has been neglected, that they don't have any positive energy left to parent their kids. So neglect the one and both will suffer. So when we choose to be child-centric, when we follow the way that the world has set us up for everything to revolve around our children, you are choosing by default to neglect your marriage, which will have a long-term negative effect on your parenting. You can't be the best parent if you're not a good spouse. And I want to go and I want to show you a little bit of what God's design was, both for marriage and for parenting. Okay, and we have to go back to the beginning, before you were in the womb. Okay, we're going back to Genesis when God created the world. In Genesis 1, verse 27 to 28, after God has created everything, we read that God created humans. And this is what we read, verse 27. So God created human beings in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. So have children, become parents. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all the animals that scurry along the ground. So that is literally when God makes human beings, we read something of His design into it that we're going to talk about in a moment. But then if you go to the next chapter, Genesis 2, God gives us a little bit more information about this relationship between man and woman. And Jesus, this is not just an Old Testament thing, Jesus quotes the words from Genesis 2 in Matthew 19, verse 3 to 6. Some Pharisees came and they tried to trap Jesus with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Here's what Jesus said. Haven't you read the scriptures? Haven't you read Genesis 2? Jesus says. They record that from the beginning God made them male and female, and He said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. See, God intended children to be raised in this love union of one man and one woman. In a union that is really sacred and special. There is nowhere else in the Bible where we read about two people becoming one. It's only when it comes to marriage. It is a special union that Jesus says is so important that nothing is allowed to tear it apart. So if we have a real enemy, which I believe we have, the Bible is really clear on the devil, and he wants to destroy society, he wants us to go against the grain of God's design, he just needs to tear apart what God said nothing is allowed to tear apart. And it's easy to use something that we really love, like children, to tear it apart. That's why 43% of people who are divorced said they fought about parenting. You see, parenting, raising a child, has the potential to either break or to make your marriage. Your children can be a testament to the love that exists between you and your spouse, or your children can become a temptation to that love. And I believe the best thing that we can do for our children, if you want to raise healthy children, besides loving God, that's the most important thing you can do. But besides that, is to protect that union between you and your spouse, which if you protect it will enable you to love your children more, not less. So here's the first thing I want you to hear today. A healthy marriage produces healthy children. And I know there's exceptions to the rules. The Bible even says it as well. Okay, there are exceptions. But I'm talking about in general, healthy marriages produce healthy children. That's the principle I think we find in the Bible. Normally, if you get it right with your kids, it means you're probably getting it right in your marriage. And an unstable marriage, if you have an unstable marriage, will create extremely poor foundations for parenting. That's why we're starting with this today. Before we talk about specifically raising our children, if your foundation of marriage is weak, you have a weak foundation to raise your children. So how do we protect this union that God has given us? As I said, Yolanda and I were married for 8 years. So we understood that we were a family before Abigail and Annabelle came along. You are a family as husband and wife before your children comes along, and hopefully you will remain a family after your children have left your home, after they've left to start lives on their own. So here's the thing I want you to hear today. Your children doesn't make you a family. Your children make your family bigger. You're already a family as a husband and wife. So if you can protect your marriage, by default, you are protecting your entire family. So how do we do it? A healthy marriage, by the way, is not a perfect marriage. Okay, we don't have a perfect marriage. You will never have a perfect marriage because all of us, we're flawed people. We're not perfect people. God is perfect and He's the only one. So a healthy marriage is not a perfect marriage, but God does give us a very simple piece of advice about how we can protect our marriage in the Bible. There is this long section in Ephesians 5 where we read about how God has intended a marriage to look like, the relationship between a husband and a wife. But when Paul starts writing this in verse 21, before he gives us all the details, he did exactly what I did at the start of this sermon. I said, I want to give you a bit of a spoiler. I want to give you a trailer so that you know what's coming. And Paul does the same thing in Ephesians 5 in verse 21. He gives us a spoiler and he says, listen, a lot of info is coming, but here's the summary. Here's the thing you need to know. If you want to have a healthy marriage, he says in Ephesians 5 verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So it goes back to Genesis 1, that God created us in His image. Our relationship with each other starts with God. And he says, if you love God, then there should be mutual submission. But that mutual submission, submitting to each other, cannot happen if you do not understand that husband and wife were both created in the image of God, and therefore they are equal. We're different, but we're equal. And often people have actually used Ephesians 5 to pull that completely out of proportion. But God is very clear that we are different, but we're equal, and therefore we have to submit to one another. So how do we protect our marriage? We protect our marriage by submitting to one another. Submitting to one another is a you-first posture that fosters a climate of selflessness. It says, I am choosing in every situation, even in conflict, in struggle, and in grief, to put my spouse first. It is a relationship where mutual respect and where mutual submission is the identified goals. We don't just go through life hoping our marriage will stay together. We say the goal of our marriage is mutual submission. So if you ask me today, Louis, okay, what does that mean? How do I submit to my spouse? How do I love them? I want to break it down into some simple terms. Every single one of you in this building and everyone watching online, if you are a spouse, if you're a husband or a wife, you need to learn how to focus on your wife or how to focus on your husband. And that is not easy because that's not how the world is training us and is teaching us every day. We live in a world that's about individualism, that's about consumerism. Everything that we interact with is telling us that life is about me, about my feelings, about my preferences, about what I like. God's way is different. His kingdom is different. And where the world will tell you the focus is on yourself, God is saying, no, the focus should be on the other. So it means that husbands and wives, and you might have to make some notes on this, but I'm going through them quickly. You have to figure out what makes your spouse feel loved. There's a great book by Dr. Gary Chapman called The Love Languages, and he talks about that. It is not, I don't show love the way I want it. I'm still first then, right? I have to learn how my spouse wants to feel loved, and I need to show them love that way. That's placing the other person first. I have to figure out what makes my spouse light up. In what environment and in what circumstances do I see them come alive? And I need to help foster that. You need to be your spouse's biggest cheerleader. Sadly, we are often each other's biggest critiquers. There's a word. Critique comes naturally. We critique each other so much, especially as we go into maintenance mode in a relationship. But guys, unless your spouse has a really serious issue with being humble and they ask you, please help me to stay humble, there's a place for a truth. The Bible is very clear on that. But for most of the time, instead of critiquing your spouse, figure out how you can be their biggest cheerleader. That's placing them first. Our goal should be to build our spouses up, not to break them down, both in public and in private, in front of your parents and in front of your parents-in-law, in front of your children and the watching world. Learn how to practice gratitude. I think one of the hardest things that most parents would agree on is parenting takes so much time that naturally you slip into a rhythm of maintenance. And then we forget. Then we forget to see and to acknowledge what the other person is contributing, right? And it becomes a fight about who's doing the most and who's doing the right thing and who's doing the wrong thing. But we need to practice gratitude for the simple maintenance things of every day. Because all of us like to be appreciated and to get credit and to be noticed. So learn again how to say you look beautiful. Learn again how to say thank you for the food. Learn again to say thank you for taking out the trash. But I don't want to talk too many tactics, because we can talk tactics till we are blue. But none of them will ever be enough. If I say communication or figure out the love languages or do that, none of that. You can go to counselors forever. But no single thing is enough if you do not get the foundational principles that a healthy marriage is built on one thing, and that is out of our love for God, we submit to one another. That is the biblical principle for healthy marriages. That is how we protect our marriages, by placing your spouse first. And I'm not talking ahead of God, but between the two of you, your spouse is first. And as you nourish your marriage, your love will spill over into the lives of your children and spill over into the lives of a watching world. And at the end of the day, if you protect your marriage, not only will you be better at parenting, but when your children are one day out of the house, you will actually still like each other. So what's the benefit to all of this? What's the benefit to having a Christ-centered, a protected, a healthy marriage in parenting? The Bible are full of these beautiful and rich texts. I actually shared it with a volunteer team this morning, one of the ones that I just read a while ago, about how when we are faithful to God, His blessing rests upon us. And I want to read one of those to you from Psalm 128. Psalm 128, verse 1 to 6, we read this. How joyful are those who fear the Lord. And remember, there's not a bad kind of fear. This is a good kind of fear. It means that I have respect for God. All who follow His ways, all who build their marriages and their parenting based on the ways of God, how joyful are they? You will enjoy the fruit of your labor. How joyful and prosperous you will be. Your wife will be like a fruitful grapevine, flourishing within your house. Your children will be like vigorous young olive trees as they sit around your table. That is the Lord's blessing for those who fear Him. May the Lord continually bless you from Zion. May you see Jerusalem prosper as long as you live. And hear this, may you live to enjoy your grandchildren. May Israel have peace. Our world is experiencing so much brokenness when it comes to families. And I read Psalm 128 and I'm like, I don't see happening in our world very often what Psalm 128 is talking about. I don't see wives flourishing in the homes. They often wither away under the stress of everything, right? I don't see children like vigorous young trees around your table. We have tables, but we don't even sit around them, right? We sit around watching other people on a screen. And our children are suffering from anxiety and stress and depression, and we don't know why. We don't even enjoy our grandchildren anymore. Some of you do. But there's also a lot of us, a lot of people in this world who have horrible relationships with their children and grandchildren. But the Bible says these things, a wife flourishing, children full of vigorous life, enjoyment of your grandchildren, that is the blessing of God's design for families. And there was this man in the Bible named Joshua. Moses led the Israelites out of slavery, out of Egypt, and because they didn't obey God, they were stuck in the desert for 40 years. So Joshua finally leads them into Jerusalem, and they experience, and he's faithful to God, and they experience incredible wins. But then at the end of the book of Joshua, he doesn't just take all of it for granted. He realizes why they suffered for a time and why they are experiencing blessing now. And he draws a line in the sand and he says, we have to make a choice. And he says in Joshua 24, and you maybe know this by heart if you grew up in church, but in Joshua 24 verse 15, he talks to the people and he says, if serving the Lord, if following Jesus, if following his plan for marriage and for parenting seems undesirable to you, then go and choose yourself this day whom you will serve. There's a lot of stuff in this world that we can serve. Money and power and wealth and other idols. Yourself. He says, choose who you will serve. The gods of your ancestors that they served beyond the Euphrates, or God of the Amorites in whose land you are living. He says, but as for me and my household, as for me and my family, there is only one way to keep living in this beautiful blessing of God, and that is to serve the Lord. That's the line I draw in the sand. There's no other way for me. He understood that a family serving God in all aspects of life, a marriage that is built on the principles of God, that will set them up for a life that is better than they could have ever imagined. A Christ, if you ask me, Louis, why are we talking about our marriages and doing it the way that God wants us to do it? Because I truly believe that a Christ-centered marriage leads to experiencing the blessings of God's beautiful design for parenting. If Jesus wasn't the center of our marriage, I wouldn't have even been married for 14 years. I'm sometimes a hard guy to live with. Never mind being a parent to my children. But a Christ-centered marriage leads to experiencing every blessing that God has designed for our families. So let's go to our single parents, because we talked about marriage a lot. And if you're a single parent, does it mean that you are missing the most important tool God has given humans to raise their children with? And the answer is absolutely not. Because the most important tool to parenting is not marriage. The most important tool to parenting, the most important factor in raising healthy children is a relationship with God. And based on that relationship, we change the way that we treat our spouses, the way that we view marriage. But if you're not married, while we're not denying that this is God's design for raising children, we cannot neglect the fact that God can always make up the difference through His amazing grace. So if you're single, it doesn't mean, if you're a single parent, it doesn't mean that there is no hope. It means that you just have to trust God more to make up the difference. So I want to encourage you here today, whether you are a parent of little children or a parent of adult children, whether you're married or single, whether you have children or don't have children, place God first in whatever you do. And everything in your life will be different. And if you are single, here's something that you could maybe do. When you place God first, He says that love should be the marker of our lives. So if you're no longer in a relationship with your child's mom and dad, what you can do as a Christian is to show that love of God by creating an environment that fosters Christ-loving children, by being a parent who honors your child's mom or dad. And I know it's not easy, but by honoring your child's mom or dad, you are showing your children that there is a bigger love that governs your life and that can govern their life. And that is the love of God. So I want to close today. And I want to encourage you, if you want to be a good parent, make time to prioritize your marriage. Okay, take time this week to write down a plan to say, how are we going to do this? To figure out how we can honor each other where we might not be doing it. But if you don't decide what you're going to prioritize, the squeakiest wheel will determine it for you. If you're here today and you're like, I want to do that, but I don't have a relationship with Jesus yet, and you said that's where it starts, because based on that relationship, everything else flow out of it, we then will help you to grow in your relationship with Jesus. So right after the service, if you go through our doors on the left, there is a boardroom, and we have our Next Steps class, Step into Faith today, where we will help you to understand what it means to follow Jesus. And we will gladly go on this journey with you. Also, if you have decided to follow Jesus, we've got baptisms coming up in May, and you haven't been baptized, go through those doors so that you're ready for baptisms coming up. It's the next step of obedience. If you are a parent whose children are already bigger and it didn't turn out so well, then I want to encourage you and say, don't tune out. Because there's a principle from the Bible specifically for that. So stay with us for the 4 weeks, and we're going to be talking about that. And then the last thing, guys, when we are with other couples who also follow Jesus, who's navigating life the same way we have to, and marriage and parenting, and we're all heading in the same direction, it makes life way easier than to try to do it on your own. So after the service today is our last day for small group sign-ups. Then we'll be starting, our small groups are starting this week for 10 semesters. So I want to encourage you, if you want to talk more about parenting and just have that flow with people who value the same things as you, go and sign up for a group after the service. And that's it. Next week, we'll talk about our second principle of how we can raise healthy, God-fearing and God-loving children. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for a design that you've built into us and built into our world to see families flourish. But I know so often we don't experience that blessing, we don't experience that flourishing because we choose to follow and model things that are different to your design. And I want to pray for every parent here today. I want to pray for every married couple, God. I want to pray that you would give us such a heart for the other person, that our own selfishness and our own egos will just disappear in this next week behind a veil of love and grace that comes directly from you. I pray that we will honor each other. I pray that we will love each other, that we will submit to one another, that we will place each other first, and that marriages will be built up in this church that are so strong that healthy children would come from those marriages. I pray for single parents who do not have that support. And I pray, Jesus, that in your amazing grace, that you will just fill that gap for them. That you will strengthen them, that you will be with them, and that you will be there for their children where there might be a gap in their lives. Thank you for your word. And thank you that we can take your word and make it part of our everyday lives. We love you, Jesus. Amen.